Hi IP licensing class, it's Professor Opterbeck, and this is the second of two videos this week to fill in some of the background from the beginning of the semester. And this video is going to focus on Chapter 2 in your textbook, and in particular is going to focus on the question of why enter into IP licensing transactions and the kind of common themes or terms that you would see in an IP license agreement of various types. And I have here on the screen, as you can see, some of the materials from Chapter 2 in the book, which includes the sort of sample fictional model license agreement that we'll work from as we go through this. So let's first talk about this piece here. Parties to the transaction decide to license intellectual property. Why license intellectual property, and what are the alternatives to licensing intellectual property? So let's kind of put here is the entity, and I'm just going to put entity 1, right? Entity 1. And let's say this is the entity. It could be an individual, it could be a corporation or a partnership, or anybody that is capable of owning intellectual property. Any legal entity can own intellectual property. So here's an entity that owns a piece of intellectual property, or a piece of something adjunct to intellectual property. And go back to the first video on types of intellectual property. I talk about the different kinds: patents, copyrights, trademarks, trade secrets, and I talk a little bit about adjuncts to intellectual property. But we can include things like like know-how, or confidential information that might not quite be a trade secret, right? These sorts of things can also be fall under the rubric that we're talking about. All right, somebody owns this, and presumably, if they own this piece of property, they want to make some money from it. Now, it's not always the case. I mean, sometimes people own property that they don't intend to make money from. Of course, think about some of your personal property. Here's my cell phone, right? I don't expect to make any money from this thing. Even if I did, sell it on eBay or something like that because I bought a new phone, I wouldn't get the value that I put into it, right? I own this to use it. Could think also about, I'm recording this from my little kind of home studio in my home office in the basement of my house, right? So I'm in my home, and I don't own my home primarily to make money on it, right? I own my home to live in it. Now, I do hope that my home appreciates in value, and eventually, if I ever do decide to move, that I have some equity in the home that I can use, right? But it's not, this home that I live in is not primarily an investment. So there are kinds of intellectual property that might not necessarily be for the purpose of making money. And indeed, people might, especially in the artistic realm. Well, let me show you an example. Here's my second book, The End of the Law, Theology, and Neuroscience. Long story. I have a doctorate in theology, and I do stuff with technology, theology, and science. Well, a book like this isn't going to make money, right? I think I've made $75 in royalties total on this book. Definitely not worth all the hours I put into it. It's an academic book. You're contributing to scholarship. I hold the copyright in it, right? So there are kinds of IP where you're not making money, but we're looking at a commercial context here. So the owner of the intellectual property wants to make some money, and they may, simply sell a product that embodies the intellectual property. I'm gonna hold you my water bottle here. This is the Sip bottle by S'well. All right, S'well has a little TM here, which means that it's a non-registered trademark, and they're trying to claim trademark rights in S'well. By the way, little review from last week. How strong would the mark S'well be for a water bottle? I would argue probably suggestive, right? Water can swell, right? Something gets filled with fluid, it swells. Swell also means, hey, that's neat. That's kind of cool. That's kind of good. It doesn't directly describe. All right, so they're using this trademark directly. They're trying to make money from that trademark by selling products like this bottle using that trademark. So that's one option, and a lot of IP owners will do that. Another option, which can either be an alternative to doing it yourself, or it can be an adjunct to doing it yourself, is that you're gonna license somebody else. So I'm gonna put this here like, direct sales, direct, right, of your own. Alternatively, you're gonna let somebody else use your IP in return for some kind of fee. Now I'll pick up my phone again. I said we'll come back to patents when we talk about trade secrets, and I'll also talk a little bit then about the patent pools and standard essential patents and all that kind of stuff. But just long story short, a phone like this, your iPhone or my Android phone, right? There are hundreds of patents that are embodied in devices, in features of this phone, either in physical pieces, physical devices within the phone, or in processes within the phone. And most of the holders of those patents are not manufacturing phones, right? And they're not manufacturing the components that are going into the phone. Somebody else is manufacturing those components. With a complicated product like this that all has to work together on a certain platform, we might have a pooled license, a patent pool. It's kind of complicated. But in any event, somebody is licensing. So another way to do it is to license. Now, an alternative to a license is an assignment. All right, assign. So the thing to distinguish here, an assignment is a exchange of title. So if I hold a patent on, let's say, a component of the Bluetooth antenna in a phone like this, and I, individual, or my company owns that patent. We invented that technology, right? And Google wants to make a phone using the Bluetooth antenna that's subject to the patent I hold. I could sell that patent to Google and just sort of, really probably wipe my hands of it. Say, Google, you pay me a certain amount of money, I assign the patent to you, you are now the owner of the patent, you can do with it as you wish. And that's a possibility, that's an assignment. And we are talking a bit about assignments throughout this course, but what we're primarily talking about is licenses. So in the license case, I, as the owner of the patent, am saying, I don't want to give up title. I want to retain title to this patent, but you, Google, who want to make the phone with an invention embodying the patent on my Bluetooth antenna, you're just going to pay me some money for the right, not owning the title, right, but for the right to use it. If you want to think of an analogy, think of the difference between the sale of a piece of real property and a lease of a piece of real property. So again, I'm in my house. If I was going away for a couple of years, and was thinking maybe I'll come back, maybe I won't, I might say, well, I'll sell my house, right? I'll sell title. Or I might say, you know what, I want to retain title to the house, but I just want someone to live in it in order to make the payments so that I can pay the mortgage and pay the taxes and maybe make a little profit on top of that, right? I could lease my house out. So in many ways, a license is like a lease of real property. The original owner retains title. And so there are a number of reasons why it can be advantageous to an IP owner to do a license rather than an assignment, or to do an assignment rather than a license. Some of those reasons and many of those reasons are business reasons, right? So some of those reasons are, for example, tax reasons. If you assign a piece of intellectual property, there's a certain kind of tax potentially on the capital gains on that sale that you might have to pay, whereas for a license you're retaining title. There's other kind of accounting considerations for how you account for the valuation over the whole lifespan of a piece of intellectual property, right? As we have seen, copyrights and patents have definite expiration dates, and patents have definite expiration dates. Copyrights have expiration dates that often depend on how long the author is alive, so it's not quite as definite, but nobody lives forever, so at some point the copyright expires, right? So those sorts of things. There also may be legal reasons to do either an assignment or a license. Copyright is a really good example of this because we will discuss we'll touch on a little bit when we talk about copyrights. If you take a copyright class, you will get into this more deeply, which is that copyrights in the past had two 28-year terms, an original term and a renewal term. And there was some litigation and then some congressional reforms about what happens when there is some kind of transaction in the intellectual property in the initial term and how that affects, how that vests or doesn't vest in the renewal term. There still are copyrights that are valid copyrights that are subject to that older law. Anything that is created after 1978 or on or after January 1st, 1978 is subject to a different system, which in general, for an individual, it lasts as long as the life of the individual author plus a span of years, generally now 70 years. Or if the author is a corporation, if it's a work for hire, lasts for 95 years. But there still are these rules about what happens after some period of time for the ability of the owner in the copyright interest to sort of claw back transfers that were made earlier in the term. Don't worry about it too much now. We'll talk about it when we talk about copyright. But just to know for now that there can be legal implications for the copyright holder if I assign it away or if I license it, and there can be differences in whether there's some ability to claw some of those rights back, and likewise for the licensee or assignee, it's a different consideration too. So there can be financial, financing considerations, tax considerations, some legal considerations that the business might want to think about when it's deciding whether it's going to assign or license. Another really important legal consideration, if you're the owner and you're assigning your rights away, you're generally dealing with one entity that is purchasing those rights. Now, it's possible there are bundles of rights in intellectual property, so you can assign certain pieces of the right to different parties depending on the transaction. But whatever piece of the right you're assigning, that's a one-off transaction. Let's just assume for now, to keep it simple, right? I have the patent on that Bluetooth technology, piece of Bluetooth technology. I'm going to assign it to Google. I'm going to get paid whatever I get paid for that, and then Google's going to do whatever it does. Well, what if Microsoft is making phones and it wants to use, or better example, Samsung, right, is making Android phones, or what if Apple, which is making phones, wants to use my Bluetooth technology in its phone? Well, if I've assigned it to Google, right, I'm done. But if I want to be able to interact with different parties who might potentially pay me to use my technology, then a license might be a better choice, because I can choose to make my license an exclusive license or a non-exclusive license. And we talked about this a little bit last week, right? But exclusive, that's an L, period, or non, right? I'll just say non-E because it's really hard to draw with my mouse here. Exclusive or non-exclusive, and those are both possibilities with all of the kinds of IP licenses that we're talking about. And again, an exclusive license, like an assignment, can be one stick in the bundle of rights of the IP, right? But if I'm going to license Google to use my Bluetooth patent, and I do that exclusively to Google, it means I still retain title. At some point that license will end, and I still have title, but during the period of that exclusive license, I can't license Samsung or Apple if I wanted to. On the other hand, if I do a non-exclusive license, well, then I'm free to, depending on the terms of the license, right? Then I'd be free to license Google and Samsung and Apple if I wanted to, right? Different considerations in legal terms and in business terms, both for the licensor and for the licensee. Now, you might say, all right, if I am Google, why would I ever agree to a non-exclusive license? Wouldn't I want to shut out my rivals to this very good technology? Well, you might. I mean, that can just be a business term. It could be that if that's what Google wants, then maybe they'll pay a lot more, right? Maybe they'll pay a lot more, even a lot more, and simply buy the thing, right? Assign it. Maybe they'll really pay a lot more and just buy my company. And that will include the assets, and very often that kind of acquisition, it's a few key personnel and the intellectual property that are the key assets being acquired. Maybe they'll do that. Or maybe it's, it's not worth that much to them, the effort to kind of shut out rivals isn't worth it, and they're just going to pay, the business deal will be a non-exclusive license. All of that is almost infinitely malleable depending on the business circumstances, which is one of the things that makes intellectual property licensing fun. It really is an interesting interaction with technology. Now, since I used the Bluetooth example, really I did just because I had the phone on my table here, I'll just note it does get more confusing because with the kind of thing when I'm talking about a phone, certain things like Bluetooth, right, it's a standard. And it is recognized that if we're going to have certain kinds of devices, like especially communications devices, but other kinds of devices too, like I'm talking to you at a video camera here, and so digital video, right, has standards to it. In order for the market to really develop, there has to be some common interactions and ability for devices to speak to each other, right? So if I have Bluetooth on here, it's got to be able to speak to a wide variety of, earphones, for example. And when that happens, you often do get a standard setting organization. There is for Bluetooth actually a Bluetooth standards organization, and then you get patent pools. So it's very rare that you would have exclusive licenses, but anybody who wants to make the underlying technology, a phone with Bluetooth, would have access to the patent pool, and there are antitrust concerns. We'll talk about that when we talk about it in a couple weeks. I just wanted to note it because I used that example. But for now, right, just realize business-wise, the owner of the IP, if they want to make money from it, has a few different options. They can directly sell a product embodying the IP. They can assign the IP to someone else, in other words, sell title, or they can license. They can license exclusively, or they can license non-exclusively. If they license non-exclusively, by the way, they might also engage in their own direct sales. And so you might, kind of sell directly in one kind of market and maybe license in another. Lots of different options that are dealt with by the business of the license. Okay, so I said that this was going to be the second of 2 videos. Actually, it's going to be the second of 3 videos because this one's already long enough. I'm going to stop this one here, and then we will come back in the next video and I will talk about the sort of typical terms of an intellectual property license agreement.